All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Gabriel Soto, and today I'm joined by Libsyn's community manager, podcast Hall of Famer, and fellow Latina, the great Elsie Escobar herself. Elsie, thanks for lending your voice today.
Thank you, Gabe, for having me on, and I am honored to be here for this bonus Latino podcast non-listener report.
Awesome, and I'm excited. I'm excited that you're here. So, Elsie, in July, Martina Castro and I presented the second year of the Latino Podcast Listener Report, where we showed that 36% of Latinos now listen to podcasts. That number in May of 2020, near the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak in the U.S., was at 25%, so a big increase.
And yet, there's still 64% of Latinos in the U.S. that don't listen to podcasts, made up of people who have never tried a podcast and some who have, but stopped. These 64% are the subject of today's webinar.
And people, don't forget to give a shout out to Libsyn, thank you, Elsie, and all other sponsors of the report, Donde Media, LWC Studios, PRX, Simplecast, Sonoro, and SXM Media for making this report available to you.
And thanks to Edison Research, a few members of their team are standing by to answer any questions you have. If you're joining us live, you can do that in the Zoom QA window, not the chat window, but the QA window. That's how you can ensure that your questions will be answered. If you're joining us after the webinar has been published, you can always email your questions to info@edisonresearch.com.
Now, in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month, let's get started. So for this report, we're going to use data from this year's study conducted in May, in which we interviewed 2,500 Hispanic and Latino adults in the U.S. online. The results were weighted to the U.S. Hispanic Latino population and their podcast listening statistics in our Infinite Dial study. And any trending that you see is from last year's Latino Podcast Listener Report. So, Elsie, I never got the chance to ask you this. How would you describe podcast listening among Latinos in the U.S.?
Booming. I am astounded by the rapid growth. 44% growth year over year is huge. And the fact that this demographic is getting so close to the overall 18 plus U.S. population shows a trend that I feel will only continue to grow. But that's not the end of the story. There's so much more.
Yes. And these non-listeners, so these 64% of non-listeners, they're made up of people who've never listened to a podcast, 44% of all Latinos, and also people that have listened to podcasts in the past but have not listened to podcasts in over a month, and that's 20% of all Latinos. So this group is made up of people who've heard of podcasts and those who haven't, of course, and we put 10 Latino non-listeners to the challenge of describing one to the best of their ability. Let's see how they did.
I think a podcast is like a recording of a conversation, and you can listen to it later.
It's basically almost like a radio station, but not really being under the major networks.
I see it as like you're in a studio with a microphone and you're just kind of telling, just talking.
Cuando uno habla sobre cómo se siente, porque es prácticamente como hacer una entrevista o hablar sobre algún tema que sea importante.
Sí he escuchado la palabra podcast, pero no estoy seguro de lo que es.
¿Se escucha un podcast o se lee un podcast?
En mi caso, yo hacía los dos, yo lo leía y escuchaba.
Is it more like a politician giving a speech? That's what I think about when I think about a podcast. So is it like a disc jockey, like a radio station? I never heard one, so I really have no idea what that is.
I'd say maybe it's fairly cheap, like $5 or $10.
And then $5 and $10, what would that get you?
A podcast session or maybe a topic or.
I don't know if they cost money or not. You know, like some of the music you download it for free, and some of the music will cost you $3 or $4. So I don't know what a podcast will cost.
Like $15.
$15 to listen to one, or
Like a month.
I'm a go-to Google guy, so if I, if I'm ever wondering something, I'll go to Google, and if I would just type in, or whatever podcast you're looking for, I would go to Google, type in so-and-so's podcast, and then probably just hit the first or second link that came up.
Well, I will go straight to Google.
Yo creo buscaría en YouTube primero.
Busco en YouTube si sale.
Well, the first thing I do, I Google it.
Yeah.
That's my, other than my wife, that's my best friend.
If you post your link on Facebook, I'm definitely going to click it at some point and I'm going to play it.
I really appreciated everybody going straight to Google or YouTube to find podcasts, with the bonus of having a wife be the solution to finding content, which I think is a wonderful solution. And also to the thought of just very interesting, the perception that podcast in some way involves a politician as the descriptor of what it is. Those are some of the curious things that I found with that.
Yeah, me too. And my personal favorite is Sergio, the person who thought that a podcast was something you read instead of listened to. During our interview, he was going on and on about the sports podcast that was something that he read, but also listened. And I thought that was super interesting. And to be honest, I was also impressed by many of the other descriptions. Many non-listeners seem to understand what a podcast is, which resonates with some of the increases in awareness of the medium that we've been seeing in all of our other research. To put it precisely, Latinos who've never listened to podcasts, so that section in blue right there, we know that 43% of them are familiar with the term podcasting. And this is a good group to ask why they don't listen, so we can get a better understanding of what we, as in the industry, can do to convert non-listeners into listeners. 70% of non-listeners say podcasts just aren't for them. And we've seen this high among general non-listeners in previous studies before. So I'm not surprised this is at the top, but this is higher than we saw it a few years ago. It's evidence that we're in a current state where a stronger rejection of podcasts might exist. But let me tell you this, what appears to be a straight up rejection of the medium at first is not really the full picture when you look at other reasons people gave for not listening to podcasts. And I think many of these serve as evidence of barriers. If you look at the bottom two, 38% don't listen to podcasts because they don't have an app on their phone. They don't have a podcast app on their phone. 1/3 say they don't listen to podcasts because they think it'll use up a lot of their phone's data plan. And Elsie, I think those people who look at these figures just have to keep in mind that these are people who have never listened to a podcast. They've only heard of it. And I don't doubt this group's reasoning for not listening. I don't question whether people actually feel this way. I think the actual question is, do they feel this way because they don't understand podcasting? And I think the answer to that is yes. When we look at this second page, many of these reasons point to people's lack of understanding. 31% say they don't really know how to find a podcast. Another 31% say they have to pay to subscribe to podcasts, like we saw in the videos. 29% say you're not sure how to listen to a podcast, and 23% say they don't really understand what a podcast is. So are you really in a bucket of people who truly do not listen to podcasts because you know it's not for you? Or do you think they're not for you because you have to pay money? You have these preconceived notions of podcasts that you don't fully understand. I think there are people in both buckets. But remember, these are people that have never tried podcasts before, only heard of it. And these same people give us a little bit of insight into, based on what they know, what might make them interested in listening. 43% say they would be interested in listening to podcasts if there were podcasts available on the topics they're interested in. So a lot of emphasis on the topic. But that's not to undervalue any of the items towards the bottom here. You have 24% of people who said they would listen if they had more data on their phone plan, 24% who said they would listen if it included stories about and perspectives from their country of origin. You have another 24% who say they would be interested if it includes stories and perspectives about Latinos. And then another 24% who said if the podcasts were hosted by Latinos. You have some mentions of Spanish language podcasts available down there. If there were more available, they would listen. And then if there were English podcasts translated into Spanish. That's still a large group of people.
Absolutely. My mom still makes choices about consumption on her iPhone based on either true or perceived notions on it eating up data on her plan. And I know that she's not alone, as you can see from the data here. In my experience as an immigrant, there was always a budget around expenses within the household, especially in the areas of utilities. Apague las luces. Turn off the lights. Don't take such a long shower. That type of thing. I can see, that carries over to data usage. For us, spending money on family and community that involved experiences of food and cooking, entertaining, gatherings surpassed anything else. And this feels like it will change as Latinx family structures and culture here in the U.S. evolve, particularly given the world that we're living in now. Now, speaking into finding stories about our own countries of origin, this feels particularly poignant. The Spanish-speaking and Latinx communities in the U.S. are very diverse, and as much as our language can connect us, and a lot of our experiences mirror each other, our countries each have a rich and unique culture. I came to this country when I was 9, and I already knew then what being del Salvador was, aka Salvi, here in the States. The older I get, the more I want to connect with my history, know more of my people, meet others that come from the same place, and are living in the United States. And I want to listen to those stories.
Absolutely. And I think many non-listeners feel that way too. Let's see what they have to say about that on the next video. And we also, in this next video, challenge some of the assumptions they make about podcasting, those assumptions that were demonstrated in the previous data. To do this, Elsie, we turned non-listeners into listeners. And the easiest way to do that...
What is that?
We forced them to listen to a podcast. Take a look.
Sweet.
Reggaeton, the beat that has taken over the world.
Hey, I'm Alicia Menendez, the host of Latina to Latina, a new Bustle podcast.
This month, we're bringing you episodes of La Brega. José de Jesús Denise Sahagún had a birthday party. It was small, just his parents and some family and friends. They celebrated on the back patio of their modest home on an isolated stretch of coast in central Mexico.
Fernando went downstairs and he bought 2 Caguama beers, which are like huge beers.
Egoísta americano, maltratando a nosotros.
Oh, my parents didn't talk about race. It was not a forward conversation probably until the Rodney King riots.
I enjoyed that one. I liked it because I could relate to it. I'm Puerto Rican. So I definitely was, listening because, that's part of my culture too. I like the fact that it was Puerto Ricans, basketball. Those are 2 of my, things I like.
It's crazy. The first thing that came out of her guest speaker's mouth was growing up in the 90s. That's me, baby. 90s. Growing up in a situation where we didn't talk about race. My parents didn't talk about race. I'll be honest with you. I didn't know I was white until I was about 10. So that type of podcast, that's the stuff people need to listen to, especially people who are feeling like they're put inside of a box like I am. I've always felt like that.
I like the topic. That's one of the things that, like the CSI TV shows, you want to find out what happened. So it gives me hooked. It's like on a book. You get started with it and you want to find out what happened. So the same with this one. It's like, now I want to see how it ended. So, yeah, I liked it.
De la forma que fue narrado, al principio cuando lo empecé a escuchar, empecé a imaginarme porque estaba la música detrás y cuando la señora estaba contando la narración de José cuando recién iba a salir de su país para venir a encontrarse con sus hijos, lo sentí como que me puse la visualización de la familia típica de México celebrando en las fiestas y eso. Y luego no pensé que venía algo tan terrible de la historia, pensé que iba a ser una historia más alegre, pero luego entrando a la información de cómo encontraron su cuerpo, me parece que es interesante de la forma que lo explicaron y me dan ganas de seguir escuchando qué es lo que pasó. Quiero saber más de la historia de José, quiero saber más qué es lo que sucedió. Yo del 1 al 10 a este le pongo un 10.
Wow. The key things that really appeal to me is when you, even just watching a snippet of what you shared here, because I know that I'm sure that there's a lot more that you got an opportunity to experience, but even just the bits that I was able to see, it's really about the recognition of, I'm saying seeing yourself because you're watching a video right now, but part of that seeing yourself is also listening to yourself, hearing the voices and being able to know that that's me and for you to recognize yourself, it immediately connects you to something more. What was really intriguing too is that even folks that have never listened to a podcast understand storytelling and they understand how you are able to inspire somebody through your voice, like a great narrator or somebody who's telling a story can really draw you in, and that there's elements that as podcasters we often use that are sprinkled through our work that's kind of like a TV show or that's kind of like a movie with music and transitions and emotion, and that makes people connect. And it was lovely to be able to see the experience people had for the first time, that this actually does, it helps you connect with yourself. That was so amazing. So amazing.
Mm-hmm. No, I absolutely agree. And I think the joy that these brand new listeners took in listening to a podcast is the reason why Latinos are adopting podcasts at such a high rate. And we established that in previous studies.
Examining these non-listeners' perceptions of podcast is important. But who are these people?
Latino podcast non-listeners are more likely to be women compared to monthly listeners. And Elsie, as a co-founder of She Podcasts, I got to stop you here and ask you this. So we've seen this trend before, not just among Latinos, but among the overall podcast audience throughout the years at Edison Research. Why do you think this is the case among Latinas? And is there anything that is unique to the Latina community?
Well, my mom. I'm always going to start the sentences with that. My mom. So my mom has always been very involved in all parts of her children's lives and work/passion. When I got into podcasting in 2006 and I started to talk about it and share with her what I loved about it, she was all in. She was curious and engaged. And at first, purely because she's invested in her children. But later, it became an opportunity for her to connect to content that she was interested in. It feels that for many Latinas, this might be the case. Listening to podcasts might start purely from a desire to stay connected to what a family member might be into, and evolves into a way in which they are captivated with topics and conversations that they can't find elsewhere. Speaking purely from my extended family experience that moved to the U.S. from El Salvador, right around the same time, the women that I was surrounded by were all highly adaptable, very curious, and willing to try out new ways of doing things.
That's interesting, and I like the story about your mom, because although you're this podcast Hall of Famer, you're a podcaster yourself, you might be in a unique experience where your mom is supporting you, but that connection that you made to podcasts, or that's how she first found out about podcasts, was through you. That is not unique to many other Latinos. We know from previous research that the number one way of finding out about new podcasts is not through the TV, it's not through the radio. In fact, it's through family and friends, through other people. And Elsie, so another area where Latino non-listeners and podcast listeners differ is in age. Latino podcast non-listeners are much older. 30% are over the age of 55, while the size of that group is 8% among Latino monthly podcast listeners. Non-listeners are also more likely to be born outside of the U.S. 37% say they are. And look at the difference between those who are U.S.-born first generation. In other words, those born in the U.S. to at least one immigrant parent.
Those are like the ones that I would say que son ni de aquí ni de allá.
Yes.
That's the in-betweeners.
In-betweeners, me. My parents are from Mexico. I was born here, and I don't belong there. And sometimes, I don't belong here. And I like to say that we're forming our own little group, unique cultures with people that I can belong with, the other in-betweeners. And the non-listeners are less likely to be in that group. So that shapes out in the English versus Spanish usage at home. If you look at this, when asked what language do you use most at home, just under half, or 46%, of non-listeners said only or mostly English at home. Among monthly podcast listening Latinos, that number is closer to 1/3, or 36%. And I think the difference maker here are those U.S.-born first-generation Latinos. It's a group that is younger, many which are still living at home in Spanish-speaking households with immigrant parents, and many non-listeners, as we saw in the previous slide, are not as first-generation as monthly podcast listeners are. Now, just because there's slightly more non-listeners in English-dominant households than Spanish, that doesn't mean they can't comprehend the language. The overwhelming majority in both the non-listener and listeners groups say they understand Spanish very or somewhat well. 76% among non-listeners and 84% among monthly listeners. Elsie, so I think we kind of have a head start in introducing non-listeners to podcasts.
I think we do. Absolutely. Let's check it out.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that although they don't listen to podcasts, they do listen to other types of audio content. They're in places where they are likely to be introduced to podcasts. And here are the audio sources they use monthly. 64% of podcast non-listeners say they listen to AM/FM radio monthly, and another 64% say they listen to YouTube for music only on a monthly basis. Now, those platforms are the strongest platforms, or the most consumed platforms among podcast non-listeners. It's also the same way for monthly podcast listeners. And monthly podcast listeners are more likely to use any of the other platforms. On a weekly basis, 58% or the majority of Latino non-listeners use YouTube for music. Now, we also know that YouTube is the number one platform for podcast listening among monthly podcast listeners. And we established that in July in the first edition of this year's Latino Podcast Listener Report. YouTube seems to have become the go-to search engine for almost everything among Latinos, especially young Latinos. And YouTube has been and will continue to be a very important point of entry into podcasting for many Latinos. And the majority of non-listeners, they're already using it for music. And another point of entry for podcasting is streaming audio. Services such as Pandora and Spotify, and over a third are already using those weekly.
Something to note in the listenership aspect here, it looks like the non-listeners are overall less listeners than their listeners, if that makes sense. Like their consumption via listening is less than the ones that actually listen overall. So part of this is interesting for me as someone who is wanting to advocate for podcasting, because that means establishing a habit of listening is possibly one of the most important things for us to note.
That's a good point. And I think another reason why I say we have a head start with non-listeners is this right here. 67% of non-listeners, they're already listening to spoken word audio or non-music audio that doesn't include TV, which I think demonstrates a propensity for podcast-like content among Latinos.
Among the most popular types of spoken word audio listened to by Latinos are news and talk shows.
And 23% of Latino non-listeners say they listen to sports talk. Another 21% say they listen to live sports play-by-play.
Now, a great idea for content for those folks out there looking to convert more non-listeners to listeners might be to develop sports podcasts. I delved into listening to football, aka soccer podcast, in 2006 to listen to the analysis about the World Cup in that year, because I'm such a nerd. And I found the shows really interesting and the conversation awesome, but heavily skewed towards European commentary and in English. Although soccer obviously is huge, it's a huge sport in Latinx and Hispanic cultures, there are other sports that speak to the younger demographic, one of them being surfing. This year, the International Surfing Association held the World Surfing Games at La Bocana and El Sunsal in El Salvador. The primary way that I consumed what was going on was through YouTube. But what an amazing opportunity to tell the story of Latinx surfers through sound and storytelling via podcasts. The potential to inspire world-class surfers representing Latin American countries would be amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's really important that you say that, because many times creators look at this data to see how they can leverage these topics to expand their audience among Latinos, but rarely is it ever done the other way around. How can we leverage Latino podcast listeners to expand sports among Latinos? Elsie, so we looked into which language non-listeners prefer to listen to spoken word audio, and 59% prefer it in only mostly English, 1/5 prefer both English and Spanish equally, and another 1/5 preferred it in mostly or only Spanish. And I think that resembles their preferences for other content like TV and movies.
Yeah, this is very curious to me. And I started to look at this data through the reflection of other media. Music in Spanish has crossed the mainstream as reflected now by the iconic song Despacito. Musicians and entertainers like, Jennifer Lopez and Luis Fonsi, Camila Cabello, Bad Bunny, Shakira, Dandy Yankee, and, so many more. But Spanish-only spoken word has not quite crossed over in the same way, although some in terms of content creation, like shows like Netflix Hentified, as an example, which includes a fabulous use of real life meets fiction of the podcast Brown Love, which is awesome, are including complete Spanish-only scenes representing the lived experience of Latinx within an English-speaking country, which brings us to the next bit of insight.
And this bit of insight, I'm glad you pointed that out, Elsie. That's an interesting point that you made there. But the insight that you're talking about, I think, also shows me that non-listeners are a bit more assimilated. And that's because their podcast listening counterparts are more likely to have a preference for Spanish. Now, I think this is largely because there are more U.S.-born first-generation Latinos in the monthly podcast listener pool, as we saw earlier. And language is an important aspect of the Latino profile. So we decided to capture all of this data and non-listeners' opinions on video. And here's how non-listeners decide in which language to consume content.
Usually, like if I'm visiting my parents, they're watching like Spanish news or Spanish movies, and that's the only reason I watch it.
La mayoría de veces, como no salen en español, pues toca verlas en inglés.
Okay.
O a veces la vemos en inglés o ponemos los subtitles en inglés o en español.
Every once in a while, I'll do Spanish. Like if my family is around and they don't speak any English, we switch it to Spanish. But if it's just me on my own, my first language is English pretty much.
Hubo un tiempo de que cuando me comunicaba, por ejemplo, con mi familia, y yo sin darme cuenta mezclaba los dos idiomas. Sin darme cuenta, en realidad no fue que algo que yo quisiera hacer, sino que era algo normal, donde mezclaba una palabra en inglés entre todo mi español. Y entonces a mi familia le causaba risa, entonces yo digo, ya tengo que seguir escuchando música o seguir mirando cosas en español para seguir.
I think as you get older, you start to appreciate your parents a lot more. You start to appreciate your culture a lot more. When I was younger, I would ask her to turn this. I don't know what they're talking about. This is so boring. But now that I'm older, it's like, oh yeah, oh my God, Mom, look at her. Like, oh my goodness, Mom, oh no. So it definitely gives me the opportunity to bond with my stepmom a lot more.
I love how context plays into the switching between languages. And context not only around location, but also who's with you, and how you're consuming it, right? And as we heard from in the other Latino Podcast Listener Report, there was that bit of data that was all around, are you consumption between family and friends, and it feels like there's that context might play into that as well, of how you switch the languages, which I thought was really very interesting.
This makes me think of the Latino Podcast Listener Report that we published in June, which showed a preference for bilingual and multilingual content, or content mixed with both English and Spanish.
Bilingual and multilingual content is and will become more and more important to grow Latino non-podcast listeners. Gabe, we've discussed how there is a generation of Inbetweeners, right? Those of us that are ni de aquí, ni de allá.
Me.
Yes, I am an immigrant and I have U.S. and El Salvadorian dual citizenship. But I was a little girl when I came to this country. And although I feel very connected to the country of my birth, to those that live there, I'm a gringa, essentially. And even though I've assimilated very well in the US, I also feel like I don't quite fit in here. A lot of us Inbetweeners have had to compartmentalize our existence, and in doing so, might have North Americanized our content consumption, possibly choosing English language content above Spanish speaking. And there are many of us that have lost our connection to Spanish, especially the first generation folks. And, there are elements of shame involved in whether or not we have an English accent when speaking Spanish, or maybe we have lost our ability to speak it altogether. Bilingual and multilingual podcasts are an opportunity to reconnect and rebuild our identities as we are now, plus create bridges for all of our Latino and Hispanic experiences within the U.S. and beyond.
And that's important because these non-listeners are also more likely to be in the older age groups. And I think those who grew up those who are older might have grown up in times when assimilation was more of a factor than being accepting of other cultures. And I think nowadays Spanish music, has hit the mainstream. People are more, they're less colorblind, you could say, and more open to different cultures and accepting of other cultures, which makes it easier for you yourself to be accepting of your own culture. Well, Elsie, I think we covered a lot of data on non-listeners. I think we should show the audience how to reach them.
Let's do it.
All right, so the good news is that the overwhelming majority of Latino non-listeners are already on social media. It's pretty comparable to podcast listeners, so that means that these non-listeners can be reached somewhere, and this is that somewhere. 71% of non-listeners who are Latino say they currently use Facebook, the same as monthly listeners. You can really see Facebook's dominance over other social media among non-listeners, more so when you see that just under half say they use Facebook most often out of all the other platforms. And I think this is a great opportunity to expand podcast listening audience among non-listeners. Wouldn't you say, Elsie? In a time when Facebook has added podcasts to the platform?
Yes, Facebook is really slowly giving access to Facebook pages, to add their corresponding podcasts. Currently, you can consume the audio podcasts only via mobile devices, so for both iOS and Android, which is fantastic. I'm happy to see this, as I know that Spanish-speaking podcasters that I've worked with often have their largest audiences in Facebook. And shout out to my mom one last time. It's the number one way that she consumes one of my shows. And historically, I posted my audio podcast as a static image video on the platform, and that's how she consumed it. I've given her all other options, but her preference ends up being this medium. My hope is that Facebook creates a greater audience experience and helps anybody who's listening easily share that content.
Mm-hmm. And device ownership. Shout out to Elsie's mom, by the way, who's really, really supportive of all of your podcasts. And one thing that we should touch on too is device ownership. For the longest time, I think people would avoid investment in Latino podcasts because of this idea that Latinos don't own smartphones. While that might have been true maybe 10 years ago, today we see that 9 in 10 Latino non-listeners own a smartphone, meaning that these devices or lack thereof is not really a reason why Latinos don't listen. Latino podcast listeners are more likely to own an iPhone compared to non-listeners. And Elsie, what can you say about this dynamic in the context that iPhones come with Apple Podcasts, but the situation with Android, it's really left up to the people to download a podcast app on their own.
Absolutely. A native podcast app for Android would be amazing to help usher in non-listeners for sure. Apple's advantage is that it has a uniform OS that they control and can deploy to all of their hardware. Android OS and corresponding hardware is a bit different, as it feels to me. Full disclosure, I am not an Android user. That pre-installed apps can vary from hardware manufacturers and can also be influenced by cellular providers. Although some are already championing their own pre-installed podcast apps like Samsung and Google. And even though a native podcast app for Android devices would be very powerful, music apps can also play a big part, as we've discussed earlier in this study. Spotify has been very influential in ushering in new podcast listeners when they added podcasts. Spotify is cross-platform, and as we've discussed, listening to music is common among Latinos. Podcasts are also supported in Pandora, the iHeart app, TuneIn Radio, and Amazon Music/Audible. And as podcasters, we could help to make sure to let our Latino audience know about those, as well as they might have existing subscriptions to some of these services already. Interesting.
Well, thanks for sharing all this knowledge that you have, especially from working at Libsyn. It's very insightful for me, and I learned some new things. Well, Elsie, I'm glad we were able to have you on for this bonus report. What would you say your takeaways are? What do you think? What do you want people to know from this webinar?
I think it's time that we take to heart that non-listeners' first experience or gateway to podcast is through video. Yes, podcasting at its core is an audio medium and it is meant to be listened to. But for these audiences, listen via podcast apps is not going to be that first exposure. Audience acquisition strategy will need to involve creating varied video content that can be as simple as re-encoding your audio as video and adding a static image on YouTube, or testing TikTok and Instagram Reels as the first exposure with optimized descriptions that will invite non-listeners to listen in a podcast app. Which brings me to the second takeaway. We need to educate about podcasting outside of our existing audiences. Our marketing plans need to expand beyond, this is our show. We have a show. Listen to our latest episode. It must include what a podcast is, platforms where you can listen, and give examples of when listening happens. It is not enough to say wherever you get your podcast or find us, insert all the names of the platforms. As you saw, one of the resistance that we had earlier that you showed, it was like, I don't have time to listen to podcasts. I think showing examples of when people might listen to podcasts, like when I'm doing the laundry, when I'm washing dishes, when I'm running, might show folks that you don't have to, you can actually do more multitask when you're listening to podcasts. And lastly, we need the support from large directories and companies to help amplify and surface relevant content for Latino and Hispanic communities. We have incredible content now. Content exists that speaks to us now, but it is hard to find. And why? Searching by language has only started to be supported recently. Shout out to Apple Podcasts for having that En Español section as of August 2020. And bilingual content is not currently supported technically. There is no way to add more than one language tag to your RSS feed. And once it is, it also needs to be supported, most importantly, by Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, the top 3 podcast apps out there.
And I will add, I think also curating your podcast, at least in my experience, the platforms that I use have begun curating. Latino Podcast makes it easier for Latinos to find things that might be interesting to them, and all other types of podcasts for diverse audiences. That I think is the easiest way to amplify some of these shows and some of this content.
Absolutely.
Well, Elsie, that was fun. This has been fun. Thanks for your time and all your perspective on this report. I'm glad we were able to get your knowledge and thank you for being willing to share all of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gabe, and to all of the Edison team for the opportunity and the support. This has been such an incredible journey.
And to all the viewers, thank you so much for joining us. A recording of this webinar and a copy of the full report will be available on edisonresearch.com immediately after we're finished here. You can check out the other Latino Podcast Listener Reports on there as well. A big thank you again to you, Elsie, and to Libsyn for sponsoring the report. And shout out to all the other sponsors, Adonde Media, LWC Studios, PRX, Simplecast, Sonoro, and SXM Media. Once again, my name is Gabriel Soto. I'll see you guys later.
Bye.